Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to talk about the oral law and Messianic prophecies. As we know, the oral law is a major concern in rabbinic or Orthodox Judaism, and in practice, it often supplants or otherwise takes precedence over the actual written Torah, the actual law. For those of us that are seeking to return to His ways, His commandments, the commandments of the written Torah, we can typically see that there are problems with the oral law and that it has a lack of legitimacy to it. There are some things about this that I want us to consider. Those of us that care about the written Torah and do not care about the oral law typically come from one of two backgrounds. I imagine that most of us either used to be Jewish in some form, then we recognized problems with that and started looking more toward the written Torah, or we used to be Christian in some form, and then we started recognizing that the system He established for us differs from what we heard before, and that He wants us to follow His commands. And we started returning to His ways through that path. Based upon my own personal experience, and this is by no means any kind of thorough survey or scientific study, a large number of those that recognize the illegitimacy of the oral Torah are often former Christians that either became Messianic Jewish or eventually became Korahite or Torah-focused or Torah-centric in some form. As a result, these people, if they were formerly Christian, never gave much emphasis or never believed in the oral law to begin with. Any credence that was given to the oral law or to the oral traditions typically resulted from our initial ignorance of the law. Once we began to understand the law better, it was obvious that those traditions were irrelevant. They were not actually a part of the written Torah. So if that is where we came from, whenever we look at the written Torah, we are not seeing references to an oral Torah. We are not seeing proofs of rabbinic authority or rabbinic traditions, and we are not thinking in terms of needing the oral law, that we cannot do without the oral law. Instead, we are plainly seeing that these are the commands, that the law that Israel is returning to is what is written, such as what we see in Deuteronomy 30:10. This is what is required. If we came from a background where we had believed in the oral law and had believed in the rabbinic traditions, we would be in a different situation. Whenever those that are Orthodox look at the written Torah, in my experience, they do not see it the same way that we do now. And I don't just mean that in the sense of how they value it. I mean that in a literal sense. It's not just that they don't look at the written Torah, but when they do, they see references in it to the oral law. They see proofs of the oral law in the text. And whenever they see the proofs of the written Torah, those are not given the same value that we would give to them. So it is a different situation for them whenever they look at the written Torah compared to when we look at it now. While it might not be quite this extreme, and it wouldn't be characterized in this way, for some, everything in the written Torah might be deemed as pointing toward the rabbinic traditions. And for some of us, this may make no sense whatsoever, but it stems from a natural process that all of us do, even if we're not doing it in that same way or for that same subject. We tend to see validation for our beliefs. This manifests in different ways for different people, but as a general rule, That is how all humans operate. Even if we might be able to try to mitigate it some and try to be objective, it is probably impossible to not do that, to not just see validation. We are not objects, so we're not entirely objective. So our knowledge and our beliefs set us up for what we can see. And depending upon our methods for looking at the text, how we personally define evidence to ourselves, and what our individual process is for considering context, we may be able to see validation everywhere. Not only can some see the oral Torah plainly and obviously supported throughout the written Torah, this could go on with other beliefs too. Some of us have probably heard of this example, the idea that every single verse in the Bible is a Messianic prophecy. Now, this requires a person to think about evidence in a particular way, and this requires a person to use a particular way to handle context. But some of us probably know that this belief does exist. As we know, there can be a slippage between what one person considers to be plainly proven in part of the text and what another person considers totally illegitimate. And it's not always clear whether we are seeing objective truth or just seeing validation for our beliefs. And in a similar way to how the oral law and the rabbinic traditions can be allowed to supplant or override the written Torah, we could allow other beliefs to do likewise. We could place special emphasis on certain passages in the written Torah, especially ones that other people would consider to be vague. And we can find ways to downplay other verses in the Torah in the process. And since no one is doing this intentionally knowing exactly in their heart that they're doing it, it's something that we have to consider ourselves. How do we handle context? How do we define evidence? What foregone conclusions are we working with as we look at the text? And how can we seek to be a little bit more objective and try to look at things a little bit more plainly? I invite us to consider all of these issues as we are continuing forward, as we are seeking to return to His ways, His written Torah. Thanks for watching, and remember the commands. Shalom.